Welcome to the Psychology Talk Podcast. We are your hosts, Dr. Scott Hoye, clinical psychologist,
and Kyle Miller, licensed counselor. Psychology Talk is a unique conversation about psychology around the globe. We speak with psychology experts to keep you informed about current issues and trends. We advocate toward reducing stigma and educate about mental health.
While you're listening, please take a moment to give us a review and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, or your favorite streaming service. It helps us to continue providing you with quality programming. And now, enjoy the episode. Hello, everyone. Today, my guest is Dr. Jia Gottlieb. Dr. Gottlieb is the former director of the Still Mountain Clinic in Boulder, Colorado. He holds a BA in physics from the University of Colorado and an MD from Northwestern University. He is here today to discuss his book, Aah The Pleasure Book. Dr. Jia, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. Well, I've been combing through and really enjoying your book. For me, it's a bit of a page turner. It's very well written, very and very well researched. It really kind of starts out with a whole gamut of like Western epistemology, correcting some things from a more modern perspective or a more inclusive, like global perspective of epistemologies, since I think you seem to have dabbled quite a bit in more Eastern traditions or other indigenous traditions. It really kind of fleshes out who we are from the ground up, biologically, neurologically, and why pleasure is a good thing rather than a bad thing. So maybe that will be a nice intro to the book and places for you to jump off on and talk about those concepts.
Yeah, well, pleasure has gotten a bad rap.
So I've heard, yeah.
over millennia. I mean, it's been going on for a long time. And in fact, Epicurus, who was the most insightful thinker about pleasure, BC, 300 or 400 BC, I believe he was the first victim of a systematic disinformation campaign. Because if you look up in your dictionary, Epicurean, what you'll find is the definition of Epicurean is someone who enjoys a fine food and drink, somewhat synonymous with a connoisseur, what we call a hedonist. And that actually turns out to be precisely 180 degrees opposite of what Epicurus actually taught. And Epicurus was a significant figure in that his school that after he died, his communities continued for about 800 years. And so he was onto something, and it was working. But then all of a sudden, it went dark, as it were. And so now, in modern day, we associate Epicurus with this, kind of debauchery way of living, and that's just flat out wrong. So that's why I say disinformation campaign.
And what do you think the cause of that disinformation campaign was? Because from what I glean, what Epicurus was really saying was more along the lines of Stoicism, but a very practical, kind of physically oriented Stoicism.
Well, yeah, he was a very practical guy, and he identified the greatest pleasure, just to give you a feel for who he was. He identified the greatest pleasure as being ataraxia, which we would translate today as peace of mind or equanimity. And his second highest pleasure, he identified as being friendship. So, I think why was he a victim of a disinformation campaign, and why do we today have this uncomfortable relationship with pleasure? I mean, most people, when they hear the word pleasure, their very first thought is sex. And the second thought is typically food or some other purely physical sensation. And pleasure is fundamental to our human nature. We are, in fact, biologically hardwired to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Mm-hmm. So pleasure and pain are the two basic behavioral reins by which we navigate through life. And consequently, if you want to control someone, you need to deal with their approach to pleasure and pain. And I believe that basically the church, the early Catholic Church, was very invested in controlling human behavior, which is an important thing to do. I mean, we have to learn how to get along together. Well, they took that very seriously and really pressed on the pleasure and pain buttons in very strong, repetitive ways to control human behavior. And so if you make pleasure and the seeking of pleasure a sin, you have created a deep internal schism in one's psyche. Because you tell a pleasure-seeking organism, thou shalt not seek pleasure. Okay, now you've got a unbalanced individual. And that unbalanced individual is now much more susceptible and compliant to control.
Well, you create a kind of inner civil war or conflict.
Exactly. You know, as Apostle Paul in Romans 7:19 said, "For the good that I would, I do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do." Now, if that is, that's what Lenny Bruce would say, cockamamie. that is, maddening. The thing that I would do, the thing I would not do, I do, and the thing I would not, I don't do. So, yes, it creates an internal conflict, which continues to this very day.
Well, it seems like there were several other Greek terms that you had used in the book. Maybe you can kind of extrapolate on those or expand on some of those, because it seems like this philosophical and the epistemological viewpoint of what was then the civilized, quote, end quote, Western world was a lot more diverse and also very much, what was it? I think it was Socrates or Plato who said
unexamined life
is not worth living. Yes, and so there was quite a bit of an examination in a very sophisticated way of looking how we experience things phenomenologically and kind of in the Greco-Roman culture, a taxonomy of those experiences.
Yes, well, you start off at the very root of the whole issue, and that's called epistemology. Mm-hmm. Which is a really important word, and it means, how do we know what we know? Mm-hmm. It's about truth and truth-making. And today, in a very contemporary political situation, what is the truth? Mm-hmm. And it's an open, now politicized question. So, Epicurus, Aristotle, so Plato, Socrates, these are the big names in Greek philosophy, and they were very clear about truth, which is you need to experience it. You need to see it for yourself. Someone says there's a fire on the mountain. Is that true? Well, if that person is an authority, a fireman, you might say, well, yeah, I think I believe that. But if you go up to the base of that mountain and you see smoke rising, you go, yeah, okay, now you're having your own experience of truth. Mm-hmm. And if you go up to the fire and you see the flames, well, now you believe, yeah, that's happening. In the same way, a lot of what we accept as truth today is secondhand or third-hand information. Someone says it's true. The election was stolen. Well, gee, who do I believe? I wasn't there. So this is the fundamental issue. And now when it comes to pleasure, how do I know what is pleasurable and what is not? How do I know what pleasure actually is? And that introduces a whole lot of, you can see the confusion. For example, psychological researchers have recently and fortunately been turning their attention away from disease and sickness towards optimal living, called the positive psychology movement, and happiness. Everyone's talking about happiness, and you can read about it and hear about it. These same researchers go to some lengths, typically, to distinguish their subject, happiness, from pleasure. And we're comfortable talking about happiness, but talk about pleasure and suddenly we get a little uncomfortable. Well, that, from my point of view, reflects a deep confusion, which is to say that pleasure is what is primary. And if you understand that as pleasure is moving towards those things that typically support life, and pain is moving away from those things that threaten it, what in earlier organisms we call instinct, avoiding, going towards what will promote and avoiding what will injure. So in human beings, we call that pleasure and pain. Fundamental, primary. If you look then at, what is pleasure? I would say a simple working definition is anything that feels good. Mm-hmm. And if you accept that, then you can say, okay, there are physical things that make me feel good. Yes, sex is one of them. Food, shelter, a warm bath on a cold night. Then there are emotional things that make me feel good, called love, happiness, joy. So happiness is not different from pleasure. It's merely an emotional experience of pleasure. That makes sense?
It makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Well, and then you can have mental pleasures, mm-hmm. pleasing thoughts that my work is valuable. I have enough money in the bank. Okay, those are pleasurable thoughts. And then the fourth level of pleasure, for lack of a better word, I would call it spiritual. That connection to some fundamental source of reality. So 4 levels of pleasure, which I describe as a pleasure prism.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And, so you've kind of given us a basic definition of what pleasure is, but what kind of really struck me while I was reading the book was this quote: "Pleasure is a natural resource as essential to our health and well-being as fresh air and clean water."
Yes, that is I go into that in the last chapter of the book, mm-hmm. which is called Renewable Pleasure for a Sustainable World. Mm-hmm. And And I believe, it is very important for us to enjoy life, feel good as human beings. And collectively, it's very important that we get on the same page about what does it mean to feel good in a sustainable way. Mm-hmm. So when I started thinking about the last chapter, I knew I had the title for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. And I got to writing it, and I thought, okay, this is straightforward, renewable pleasure. If you go to the beach and walk along the sandy shore, you leave a relatively small carbon footprint. Mm-hmm. However, if you have to fly 1,000 miles to get to that beach, it's a much larger carbon footprint.
Correct. Yeah.
So very straightforward understanding of renewable pleasure. To my surprise, I discovered, and this is one of the joys and values of writing, is that, as the writer, I'm discovering things coming off the page. And I discovered that renewable pleasure, thinking of it as a resource, is very powerful. Because if you understand pleasure as a natural resource that we all need, just like air and water, then it immediately removes it from over 2,000 years of moral sabotage and all kinds of ideas people have, cultural baggage about pleasure, and it puts it into a natural science framework. And so then we can think about it more objectively with fewer value judgments. So that in itself is very useful. Then as I looked at it as a natural resource, well, where do you find that pleasure? Okay, well, food and reading good books, listening to nice music, physical types of things, hanging out with your friends, emotional kinds of things, intellectual pursuits, spiritual pursuits, good and well. But ultimately, I discovered that the deepest source of renewable pleasure that we all long for is, in fact, the pleasure that one human being exchanges with another. We call it love. We call it companionship, friendship, community. This is fundamental to our desire because we are herd animals. So we don't live alone, isolated existence. We live in community, fairly dense communities compared to other animals. Mm-hmm. Well, then, if you and I are the source of renewable pleasure, why don't we just give it to each other? Why do we need to have this, middleman distributing and deciding what pleasures can be exchanged and which pleasures cannot? You see, that becomes radical.
Oh, it becomes very radical. We have, one of the basic concepts I took away from the book is that we have a consumer appetite for things we don't need. And really, the solution is to turn to pleasure and your own appetite for pleasure with curiosity.
Yes. Tell me, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that is very radical. I think that the church has basically been replaced and the monarchies have been replaced, and the empires have been replaced by globalism. There's still empires, right? I do think that, every monolithic culture has its army and its hierarchy, which you even kind of look at that origin of that word in the book, I believe.
Hierarchy. It's the ruler.
Right, the ruler, right?
Tyrants.
Yeah. And it's kind of like a godlike idea, right? If there's something above you and you're below that, and it's organizing this kind of pyramidal structure.
Exactly. Yeah. Keep going. You're getting it.
So what I think, why is it so, if you provide someone with a true like Stoic or Epicurus or Epicurean philosophy, or that you can be the sort of master and commander of your own ship in life and be able to cybernetically sail your ship, right, on your own, you basically trump the need for somebody to sell you something or influence you kind of mindlessly. And I think that one of the other, I think as a psychotherapist and anybody who works in the medical field, you pointed out a very interesting chapter, part of a chapter. You went with your daughter to Esalen. Yeah. And you realized that after this wonderful taking in the environs and going to the place where people like Hunter Thompson, Carl Rogers and other folks at the hallowed halls, yes, had walked about there, including the founders and Mr. Murphy and whatnot. So I think that you took into the fact, you honed into the fact that the conversation in the cafeteria afterwards, which was cut off from nature in Big Sur, right, in the beautiful Northern California surroundings, ironically, they're cut off in glass and wood. Everybody talking about how they're fixing their stuff, their hang-ups. So the only way you can really sell or market something is to tell someone that they have something that needs to be corrected, rather than something they can navigate on their own or figure out themselves. So, of course, with a risk of everyone in my practice leaving my practice now that the gig is up. And be careful. Be careful. Although that is the goal of my practice, I don't want people to stay and see me forever, unless they need to or really want to. I think that this is part of this philosophy. Why it's so radical to us is that it is affirming the goodness of the individual amongst the community.
Yes, goodness itself is a synonym, an equivalent word for pleasure. How do I know something is good? It makes me feel certain pleasant sensations in my body. When I look at that piece of art at the Art Institute of Chicago, and I feel pleasant sensations, like, wow, that's a good picture. That's a beautiful picture. So good, beauty. And I would say truth. Intellectually, when you hear the truth, it has a ring to it. And it arouses pleasant sensations in the body. So I think you've put your finger on a very important facet of this book. As a psychotherapist, as a person who works with people who are suffering, which I, as a doctor, also did, Mm-hmm. What is the root cause of that suffering, and how can I be of help to relieve it? Well, we get into this problem of selling something. So if I tell you, you are a sinner, and as a matter of fact, you were born a sinner, well, what are you going to do? Who are you going to call?
Ghostbusters? No way.
Yeah. And that you have to come and talk to me so that I can talk to the big guy to relieve you of that sin. Well, you've created a very powerful business model. And look at who owns all the great real estate and around the world, and you'll see how effective that business model is. So my book, fundamentally, one of its main goals is liberation. Mm-hmm. Liberation from what? Liberation from this sense of hierarchy, sense of being controlled, exploited, manipulated, so that I can become the master of my own life. It's called freedom. Mm-hmm. It's in the Declaration of Independence. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As I point out in my book, that whole paragraph, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that was penned by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a self-avowed Epicurean. So at the very heart of this great American experiment, you find Epicurus. Most people don't know that, right? It's all been hidden.
Well, it's attributed to the church fathers, right?
Yeah. So there's been this struggle going on for control of the human consciousness. Mm-hmm. And what do we pay attention to? Well, look at the nightly news. It's telling us what we should pay attention to. And much of it is based in fear. So we have a fear-centric operating system at the very foundation of our culture and the very foundation of our psyche.
Correct, yeah. Well, you mentioned in the book, and you mentioned, as we've been discussing, the concept of different levels of the prism of pleasure. But in the book, you connect them neurologically, which I found really fascinating, to the different, 3 layers of the brain, and something beyond that that's more of like a gestalt of the whole thing, if you will. Or when you apply the chakra system, something above and beyond the 7th chakra, for those out there who are interested in that kind of dynamic or map of the body and mind. But can you kind of talk about how, to give some examples for people that are constructive and can pinpoint their behaviors that might be connected to those pleasure centers or those portions of the brain, the midbrain, right, hindbrain, forebrain?
So as I said earlier, there are 4 levels of pleasure that I describe in the pleasure prism: physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. These are not arbitrary categories or levels that I particularly thought of. This is a reflection of the evolution of the human forebrain. And as Paul MacLean, who was an MD neurobiology researcher back in the early 50s, he did a lot of research, neuro and anatomical research, to understand basically what we call the psychology of the brain. How's it work at this phenomenological level that we experience ourselves and experience life? And that led him to an understanding of the triune brain, 3 in 1, triune. And he started by looking at reptiles, which corresponds to the brainstem and so-called hindbrain, a primitive part of the brain. And in order to understand that part of the brainstem, he studied reptiles. He brought them into his laboratory and he observed them. And he also observed them in nature and discovered what makes them tick. And the basic notion of reptile, which, is a creature that's mainly a long spinal cord with it's easy to remember. Reptiles like to repeat. Reptiles like to repeat. Repetition. Yes, they will go on their way to their feeding site. They will take the long way around rather than the shortcut, because they always take the long way around. That's their habit. They feel safe and secure in doing that. And they have the same defecatory post. Think of the lounge lizards who go to their favorite drinking. Okay? So we have that reptilian aspect. And you can see it in your own body by just looking at the back of your hand. You'll see what looks like a lot of lines. And if you were to thicken it up, you would get scales. We have a little tail tucked discreetly between our legs. Okay, this is our reptilian aspect, which we tend to denigrate. But if you step back a little bit, easily 60, 70% of everything we do is under the control of our reptile. Every time I scratch my nose, reach for a glass of water, I don't think about it. It's habit, it's repetitive, it's reptilian. Okay, fair enough. The next level of evolution was early mammalian. And those scales were replaced with fur. Some of us have like furry faces under our arms, our hair, right? Okay. Early mammalian brain, and that corresponds to the midbrain, or what we might call the limbic emotional brain. And that's where you get herd animals living together, where you get mothers, fathers, babies, emotional feelings that reptiles, for the most part, don't have or don't demonstrate. Warm, cuddly, fuzzy feelings. That's the reptilian brain. And then the third level of the human forebrain to evolve was the cortical brain, or some people call it the monkey brain. That's the conceptual, symbolic manipulation, planning type of brain. And in our human brain, that takes up about 3/4 of the brain volume. So we have a lot of invested in our cortical brain, and look at what we've done with it that other animals have not been able to do. Mm. And we tend to bow down to and honor our cortical high brow. And that really started with three great thinkers: Socrates, whose student was Plato, whose student was Aristotle. 1, 2, 3. And they put this big impression that, hey, it's all about being rational and reasonable. That's what we need to do. And this emotional stuff, this reptilian, that's primitive. But we got back with that. Well, that sounds good. But when that cortical brain, monkey brain, starts thinking up how to create nuclear weapons, how to weaponize viruses and other infectious vectors, how to exploit and enslave, well, you could argue that it's gone awry. We got to keep that monkey, wisen it up. And we're called Homo sapien, sapien meaning wise, but we have yet to develop that.
Well, it seems to me, it's more of a conversation between the three parts of your brain, which is what psychology and neurocognitive science is looking at, especially when we look at dreams, especially, from Freud on, when we started to look at it as this kind of conversation. And now we're saying that different parts of the brain are engaged in dreaming, and it's kind of more of a lizard brain talking to the emotional and to the higher cortical functions.
How does the lizard brain speak? What does it say?
I need food. I need to recreate myself. Yeah, I need to do those things that are desire-based that might not work too well in society if I just unleash it like an id, so to speak.
I asked you kind of a trick question, right?
Okay.
Because reptiles don't talk.
True. So how does it think? Probably more imagistic, yeah, if at all.
Well, yeah, let's be precise here. Images I would suggest.
You're probably more higher cortical.
Abstract form of thinking is a cortical function. And this is where we get into the difficulty of integrating these three brains, because the reptile doesn't speak and doesn't deal with concepts at all.
It just does.
It does.
Reacts,
Look at a snake or a lizard, and that's what they do. And that's what Paul MacLean did. And then look at a mammal. Look at your dog, cat, cow. They're not talking much. I mean, they try. Some ways. It's hard to know exactly what they're saying, but you get to know after a while a few words of your favorite pet. So we have this disconnect between the cortical brain, which is thinking and talking and conceptualizing and imaging, creating ideas and meanings and purposes. And we do it so second nature that we just think that's who I am. But as I pointed out earlier, actually, who I am is maybe 70% reptilian. And so how do we get in touch? How do we integrate? The pleasure prism has 4 levels. So physical, emotional, mental, 3 parts of the human forebrain. The 4th level, which I call in my book osis, which is in lieu of spirit. Mm-hmm. The 4th level doesn't have an anatomical correlate. There's only 3. So where's the 4th? I call that homo spiritualis, that this is where we are evolving towards. Mm-hmm. And how do we get to this highest point of evolution, for human evolution, and highest point of pleasure, which is the realm of ecstasy, bliss, and equanimity? How do we get there? Not by transcending the lower aspects of our being, but by descending, actually going down, getting familiar with, comfortable with, and training the inner reptile, the inner mammal, bringing that into balance in a organized, harmonious function with the cortical monkey mind. And when those 3 come into relative balance and harmony, we spontaneously have access to that spiritual realm.
Right. And I think that in some respects, psychotherapy looks for balancing those things out as well. I mean, many of the issues that people come to a psychotherapist or psychologist with are emotional issues, and it's an inner conflict, and it's usually between a drive or an impulse, which is, like, as you said, and I would agree, 70% of us is that iceberg under the water, the subconscious or unconscious mind, and most of that is driving what we do, literally, a lot of the times, most of the time. Well, tell us a little bit more about this conversation. Is it a conversation and an integration, or how do you balance out abstract reasoning with heartfelt wisdom and that repetitious lizard brain?
Thank you for asking, because with all due respect, talking and talk therapy can only most directly reach that monkey brain, which is important.
I would say that, yes, I think talk therapy is 70% of the time working with a person's default mode network and waiting for something to happen when, trying to establish that rapport and kind of go back in time, whether or not you're using CBT or some other kind of technique, or if you're throwing hypnosis as a technique. And I think largely it's working with those defense mechanisms that are based on basic epistemological assumptions about the patient that the patient has or the client has, and waiting for them to say, hey, like, isn't there a discrepancy going on there? What's this discrepancy? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? Don't you have desires and needs? Don't you, it's about loving yourself a little bit more, and more and more. Or you could also say that even like now trauma is a big, I would say kind of a marketing platform for therapists. People out there are going to send me dirty letters and nasty notes. But I think that, again, it's this kind of conversation with yourself and yourselves. But I interrupted you, so go ahead. No. You said it. Okay. Right. Let's move on. No, just kidding.
With yourselves, a conversation with yourselves, right. Not just cortical selves, but mammalian, reptilian as well. Yeah. So how to do that was the question you asked. And I think that cortical cognitive piece is very important because we are very much, 3/4 of our brain is orienting towards that. So that's very important.
Well, we represent ourselves through that cognitive part.
Exactly. So the ways in which I train my cells, most recently, for example, I'm learning to tango.
Okay.
What that does, tango is a dance, a Latin dance, and it's an embrace. So two partners, a leader and a follower, typically a man and a woman. And that brings me in contact with all parts of myself simultaneously. I have to learn these intricate, repetitive step patterns. That's very reptilian. And I need to get that so well down, which it's not so easy in tango, as it turns out, that I don't have to
It's a difficult art form to learn, yeah. It's very.
I don't have to think about it. I can just feel it, and my inner reptile is comfortable doing those physical movements. Then there is the encounter of another human being in what could be a close embrace. So, and I tend to be a bit shy.
So it's working through some emotional conflict, yeah.
It brings me in touch with that mammalian part of myself, companionship, love, care, kindness. And then there is the mental part of understanding the structure of the dance and rhythm, the timing structure. Rhythm by itself is very reptilian. It's very repetitive. That's why we relate to rhythm so strongly. And when it's all working well, both myself and my partner have this feeling of, we're dancing. This feels great. That was good. Maybe it only lasted for, a couple of measures of the song because I had that down. And so I like to integrate my cells through an activity.
Good.
In real time, real life, in a non-therapeutic context. The therapeutic context, which is a very important one, unfortunately, often functions from the presupposition that something is broken, that needs to be fixed. That is a pathological model. I prefer, as much as possible, to operate from a place of, instead of the fear-centric, what's wrong, from a love-centric, what's right.
Yeah, I think, as you hinted earlier, the positive psychology movement, which is nothing new. I think that's just an extension of Maslow's ideas of peak experiences, and before that, Adlerian ideas, and you name it, logotherapy ideas from Viktor Frankl. It's just that I think in order to sell something, if you're part of the monolithic culture, if you're part of medical society, which behavioral health is, you gotta sell them the goods. And the goods is they're broken. And so, but I think things are moving away from that. And I think, I hate to not mention somebody I really appreciate, Milton Erickson, who's a father of modern hypnotherapy or hypnosis, who is very much, very positive. What do they call it? Teleologically oriented, and just like Alfred Adler and a lot of other people, goal directed. What are you trying to do, and how can we correct your trajectory? You're doing something good. It just this ain't working here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I'm all for people doing things outside of the consulting room and having a eureka moment, right? Having that aha moment or awe moment, right? If you will. and I think that's precisely what the book is all about. And I think that's what life's all about. I came to psychotherapy and psychology as a former actor, musician, and artist. My undergrad was a BFA in printmaking and art history. So
cool.
I wore a lot of hats in my life, and they're all good. And I made great mistakes, and I'm going to make some more great mistakes and learn a lot more.
and a good therapist is indeed an art.
I believe it is, yeah.
A creative art.
Many of my colleagues in the ivory tower would disagree because they want to look at outcome studies and factor analyses, but, maybe they do agree on some level.
They don't have that artistic training that you have.
Yeah. Well, I gleaned also that you play the bamboo flute.
Yes, I do. That's another way for me to develop myself and bring them into harmony musically. Yeah. But what you're describing, I'd like to put a few words to.
Absolutely.
Which is tension between marketing, selling something, in what you call the monoculture.
Mm.
Okay, well, so there's an economic engine paradigm operating here that is huge. And you try to step out of line, you just may go broke.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. As I'm talking about this, hopefully the insurance companies I'm paneled with won't start vetting me. I say that laughing, but touch plyboard. But that is as you know, having worked in the medical fields for so long, it is very much like that monolithic, the big giant monolithic culture that we're all kind of part of. I think, for me, I've really enjoyed not having to be in the busy stream of things as per a stranger in a strange land, right? Like the guy who comes raised by Martians, who shows up and sees people not talking or connecting with each other and not loving each other. And this doesn't make any sense. I think the past year and a half or so has been very good for a lot of people to go, wait a minute. I don't necessarily have to buy all of this, and unplugging at varying degrees.
Right. A huge wake-up moment for many people.
Yeah.
Who also, many of those people have gone back to sleep just as quickly. But there are those who have said,
now, which part of their brains might be enacted to go back to sleep and go back to their repetitive behaviors?
It's a cortical thing.
Yeah.
I think it's the belief in what I call the matrix, that hey, this is what I need to do in order to not only survive, but thrive, raise my family, make a living, feed myself and those I love.
It's also very ritual, too. Going back to the old ritual, because that's the old pattern. I think that's more the reptilian kind of, yeah.
Absolutely, very reptilian. So there's a lot of pressure for us to try and go back.
Yeah.
I just sent out a newsletter because it became totally clear to me. I have a monthly newsletter, The Pleasure Report. And in this month's Pleasure Report, it's titled, The Time is Nigh. Meaning we're getting close. And that's that international panel of climate scientists that has been well publicized saying it's red alert. This is it. There is no other warning here. And this may be our last report because it only comes out every 6 or 7 years, and we're at this tipping point. And the understanding that there is no going back. It's not that we just get new technologies or get the right leaders in Congress and the presidency. There is no going back because how we've been living on this planet is unsustainable. We must go forward and live in a new way. And I believe in order to get there, we need to radically shift from our fear-centric operating system of us against them, whoever we are and whoever they are, whether it's the Greens versus fossil fuel, the Americans versus the Chinese, the democracies versus communism, whatever. That paradigm of us against them is passé. When a Ebola virus can travel from Kinshasa to London in a matter of hours.
Yes.
When pressing a nuclear button could bring on nuclear winter. So we have to go beyond that. And the irony is that we are at a place as human beings, as a species, that we have this tremendous industrial capability and cortical intelligence to essentially create something like heaven on earth at a material level.
But it seems to me we have to step away from these paradigms that are anti-pleasure, right? Anti the goodness of the body, the goodness of the earth, the goodness of the cosmos, and move towards something that is more embracing of all three worlds, if you will.
God, you said that so beautifully.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. I totally agree.
Yeah. Maybe you can speak a little bit more towards a kind of intervention bent, not with, because there are some aspects of the book that you elucidate some of those things. But how can people, if they don't want to tango, or if they don't want to play the bamboo flute or make prints, how can they embody themselves a little bit more, or what are ways? Because each chapter it's almost like as I was reading it, it's like you put the abstract at the end of the chapter rather than at the beginning of the chapter. And it's a nice little summation of the chapter in your book with little questions to ask yourself. But can people go beyond those chapters as they read the book to something more practical, like something doable, tangible?
The considerations are, take a look at this, consider that. Yeah. And that's the beginning of the hands-on. I am currently working on my second book, which is going to be the guidebook, the how to do, and completely focused on the practical living of play. And what people can do now, immediately, this morning or afternoon, wherever it is begin to first recognize the primary importance of pleasure in their life, how it defines so much of who they are and what they do. So first, recognize the primary importance of pleasure. Make it a front burner item. And then have the humility and curiosity to say, maybe I don't know what it is. I've never really thought about it. My parents never talked to me about it directly. I never took a course on it in school. I never read a book about it. Okay, fine. No shame, no blame. It's something to discover. That then begins a process of exploration and self-discovery of what actually does feel good. And to make this more precise, when you are in having a pleasant experience, rather than distract yourself, like, for example, I'm eating, and I'm often eating alone. So, I'm watching the news or reading something, and that is a huge distraction from the act of eating. If I turn off all that media and I sit with that bowl or plate in front of me, and I take a bite of it without distraction, and I focus my attention, all of my attention, on that bite, I begin to have a deeper experience of the pleasure of food. Mm-hmm. And not surprisingly, that meal becomes more fulfilling, not just calorically, but emotionally, spiritually.
Well, it seems to me it's the difference between not to pick on the Brits, but the British way of having lunch versus the French way of having lunch, which the British way is to get the calories in, maybe have a pint or two or three, and do that in half an hour to an hour and get back to work. Excuse me. However, the French typically will sit, have a glass of wine, maybe share a bottle, sit for a couple of hours. I'm generalizing here between the two cultures, but the ability to sit and enjoy company, enjoy the environs, and just to have the pleasure of it.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And here's where it gets tricky. Okay, eating, sharing a meal. It's one of the great renewable pleasures, human-to-human exchange, doing something that we both enjoy. Well, why do we then reach for a glass of alcohol?
This is something you elucidated in the book. And yes, please tell us. Please share with the audience. Yeah.
Well, this is, let's talk about this neurobiologically. Yeah. Alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. It is actually a toxin. And when we first start drinking, it inhibits our prefrontal cortex inhibitory function. And so the prefrontal cortex is what judges and lays down, morals and so on and so forth. And when that is incapacitated, now I feel a little freer and easier and relaxed. I'm having a better time actually. Okay, that's fine. But, you keep drinking and you realize then the sedative effects become more pronounced and you go into eventually a stupor and if you could die. So why is it that when we are having a pleasant experience of sharing a meal or going, in my book, I talk about going on a river trip, and how heavy people are drinking, or going skiing and what they call après-ski, which is to drink as much as you can, or open your little silver flask on the chairlift and take a swig. Why is alcohol so much a part of what we call pleasure? And here's where, if you begin to investigate, you'll realize that as I begin to experience pleasure, I have a limited capacity. Just as I have a limited capacity for pain, I have a limited capacity for pleasure. There's only so much feeling good I can handle before I have to say, hey, give me a sedative, take the edge off, because I'm at my limit. It's paradoxical. And don't take my word for this. Examine yourself. What happens when you drink a beer, a glass of wine? What happens as you're doing it? How you know it's time to have a drink? Okay. I just had a great hike. It was a fantastic day. It's time for a drink. Oh, that's interesting. I was feeling so good.
Yeah, and then it's a celebratory. Yeah, celebrating the good things in life by intoxicating yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. What's with that?
Probably too much of a good thing has to be tamped down, as you're saying. Yeah.
We have a limited. I put it simply, just as I have a limited capacity for pain. At a certain point, I ask, or beg the dentist for some Novocaine to dull it. In the same way, when I'm really enjoying myself, there is a limit to how much I can handle. And this is subtle. You're making love. It's fantastic. The moment you say, this really feels good, you've diminished that experience. You've objectified it.
Right. Once you start to conceptualize it when that part of the mind, or if it doesn't go away, you might not have the same experience of somebody who's fully involved in the midbrain and hindbrain. Yeah.
And then you have situations of like a friend of mine is an Olympic marathon runner. And I write about this in the book a bit too. People are pushing themselves to the extreme physically, psychologically, and experiencing ecstasy and bliss. So why is pleasure and pain? You fall in love with someone. This feels great. We're having a great time. And then it turns bad. And I hate this person. I got to get out of here. Pleasure and pain, why are they so closely intermingled? These are questions that I'm raising, which of course I address in my book. But you asked, what can people do? And I would say, begin asking, first recognize pleasure is important. Begin to observe it in your life in real time and watch how you go about being a pleasure-seeking organism. Just watch how it works, and all will be revealed. It took me, 15 years plus of writing this book to get a handle on what I just said for myself.
Well, as you were writing it, I'm sure that it was being informed by more research in neurobiology. Yeah. It
took me places. Yeah. It has really educated me in many dimensions. Yes.
Yeah, I likened it to, in some respects, to Robert Graves' The White Goddess, which takes you in so many. If you've ever read it, I recommend it. It's a bit of a roller coaster ride, but it takes you through, history, prehistory. A lot of suppositions are probably not very logical, but still. I'm not saying that about your book, but Graves's book is very much like this. And the book is just, it's a wonderful historical and scientific kind of journey.
Okay. Yeah. Well, as we're mentioning other books, I would highly recommend Aldous Huxley's Island.
Okay.
It was his last novel, and he's just a beautiful writer. And he describes how a love-centric culture, a utopian culture, could actually operate when the whole monolithic cultural system isn't based on fear, but is based on love and joy and goodness. Mm-hmm. What would that look like? And his book is really a wonderful novelistic exploration of my book. That they're just like
parallels.
Knowledge and fiction. It was stunning for me and really enjoyable.
Had you read it after you
After, yeah.
Wow. Okay. I noticed one thing you didn't dive into in the book was attachment theory.
What do you mean?
Relationship attachments that develops in children from, say, day 1 to about age 7, right? Or age 2.5, with attachment to the mother or the central parenting figure, typically the mother. I think that that has a lot of parallels. I'm sure you could have gone into that, like as far as like secure attachment, anxious attachment, dismissive attachment, and chaotic attachments. All right. I mean, I think that that's probably the main thing that psychology has really, and psychiatry has really hit the nail on the head with. It's kind of cross-cultural, it's universal, and it just plays itself out in our lives. That first formative relationship where we build these conceptions, right, as our forebrain starts to come online slowly but surely, and we're kind of more of a conversation between our drives or a lizard brain and our midbrain. You're developing your emotional brain and conceptual brain along with the cortical, like, part of the brain, the brain stem. I mean, and I think that I think there's a parallel there. I won't go into it too far, but I'm sure that if you delve into attachment theory, that might be something to look at, and conceptually fascinating. And just there's so much theory in that right now.
You're touching on something so fundamental to our whole psyche and psychological development, which is our first experience of pleasure at an emotional level.
Yeah, exactly.
And what is that first experience? What did we learn there?
Yes.
And then how does that play out in the rest of our lives? Wow, that is just huge.
Yeah. I think that you could combine the ideas you've elucidated very much with that. Yeah, easily. I think and there's enough. Yeah. I mean, yeah. And it is huge. The experience of being loved, the experience of feeling secure and developing security, or rather not, if the mother doesn't have the proper wherewithal to provide the baby with their temperament, with that first formative relationship, so they feel secure. Do they pull away? Is the mother too anxious and intimidating? Do they pull away? Do they have more of a distance and aloof connection to people? Yeah.
If the was really busy because she has 7 kids.
Correct. Yeah.
Because they moved 12 times in 10 years.
Attachment to place. Yeah.
Wow. And the mother's trying the best she can, and even to work as well. What kind of attachment experiences do those offspring have? Mm-hmm. And how does that play out in the rest of their life? Yeah, I think you just really opened my eyes to this very profound aspect of pleasure, which is, when we're very young, we're like an uncarved block of wood. Mm-hmm. And those very first impressions make deep gouges, cuts, and ideally beautiful woodblock prints.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or not. Mm-hmm. And that's our template for intimate relationship going forth as adults.
Or just connecting to people socially, yeah, at an emotional level. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. That really opens me to this whole other dimension of thinking that early pleasure programming.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And obviously I think you can see the lines of connection between concepts you've discussed and going back to a person's experience, right? Yeah.
And a lot of it is completely nonverbal.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Oh, it's absolutely. It's 24 months. Yeah, you're just starting to speak, really, right?
Give me, what's the age range for this
attachment? Usually starts age, day 1 to about 24 months, right? Yeah.
24 months.
Yeah. And
years old.
Yeah, 2 years old. 18 months to 2 years old, I believe that's when it happens. And then core conflictual relationship models continue within the family up until about age 7. So you're developing that kind of limbic system interaction between personal needs and distance between authority figures or others, and how much close you need to be to them, how distanced, how secure you can be in yourself within connection to other people.
Right. So I don't know that much about psychotherapy and theory and so forth, but I think Freud kind of got the ball rolling in
Absolutely.
the West.
Yeah.
And he had his pleasure principle, and probably if he had read my book, he would have this wow, it's all pleasure, and what are those developmental stages of pleasure that we go through?
Exactly. That's that'd be an interesting model to flesh out. Yeah.
Great, I invite you.
Well, on that note, maybe we should wrap up here. I was going to maybe take this further into more. Maybe we can do that before we wrap up. I'm sure that this is quite a possible area we could go into. Those, like we would say, more conceptual pleasures, right? A great quote from Goethe, of course in German, not in English, like I'll say it, was, what is more edifying than light? Conversation. And I think we've had a very edifying conversation here. Maybe you can kind of touch upon how these experiences are a kind of pleasure, like conversation as a pleasurable experience.
Yeah, I have really enjoyed meeting you like this and talking about these things that I'm so interested in, and hearing your perspective, which is not the conventional, psychological take. You have this broader range from which you're working, and for me, a conversation like this, I imagine, is what jazz players experience when they jam together. Or good tennis players, they can just keep the ball moving, and different spins and different angles and aspects. So, we can continue this at another time.
I would love to do that.
This whole thing about attachment would be fun to kind of in real time.
Improvise and riff. Yeah.
In real time, let's just explore this and see what we find.
Yeah.
I think it would be a fascinating collaboration.
Absolutely.
I'm totally open to that. And this is what I call, what we have been experiencing, renewable pleasure. It's just so simple. Now, we are doing it through the medium of a very sophisticated cultural engineering setup, but it's empowering us from a great distance to be able to just have a conversation. I get to see you and experience you, and so it's been thoroughly enjoyable.
Meeting of minds. Yes.
Yes. And if you haven't already, I would suggest taking a look at my website at drjiamd.com. That's drjiamd.com. And there you can see the book trailer, which is my little piece of art, is the way I think of it. And lots of information about pleasure, excerpts from the book. There's an Audible book So I've been listening to a lot of books. It's really an easy way to learn things as I drive or walk. And yes, that experience of it's ever imminent. We just need to kind of open ourselves to it.
It's all around us, waiting for us to, with curiosity, experience it. Yes. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gottlieb. This was truly a pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for listening to the Psychology Talk Podcast. Did you know that the Psychology Talk Podcast has a Facebook page and an Instagram page? It's true. You can find more information about other guests and episodes, as well as more information about psychology and mental health. And if you liked this episode, go ahead and like us on Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Stitcher, or Spotify and leave a review. It helps us grow our audience and provide more quality shows. All material, copyright the Psychology Talk Podcast. This podcast is for informative and entertainment purposes only. If you need a mental health professional, please seek one out. Music is provided by the band Serenati.